Hello, this is your Algerian teacher and welcome to Grow the Branches channel. Today we're going to see a well-known literary movement, that is Romanticism. Romanticism is a literary movement that lasted from 1798 with the publication of the famous lyrical ballads, poems by William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge to sometime between the passage of the First Reform Bill of 1832 and the death of Wordsworth in 1850. Historical context. With political revolution on the continent and the industrial revolution underway, the period witnessed the breakdown of ideas about the structure and purpose of society and the known world. During this period, emphasis shifted to the importance of the individual's experience in the world and one's subjective interpretation of that experience rather than interpretations handed down by the church or tradition. Characteristics of the Romantic literature. Romantic literature is characterized by several features. It emphasized the dream or inner world of the individual and visionary, fantastic or drug-induced imagery. There was a growing suspicion of the established church and a turn toward pantheism, the belief that God is part of the created world rather than separate from it. Romantic literature emphasized the individual self and the value of the individual's experience. The concept of the sublime, a thrilling emotional experience that combines awe, magnificence and horror, was introduced. The concept was introduced by the Irish philosopher and Member of Parliament Burke, and it attracted the attention of the French writer and co-founder of the French Encyclopedia Diderot and the German philosopher and Enlightenment thinker Kant. Feelings and emotions. Feelings and emotions were viewed as superior to logic and analysis. For the Romantics, poetry was believed to be the highest form of literature, and novels were regarded as a lower form even by those most addicted to reading them. Most novels of the time were written by women and were therefore widely regarded as a threat to serious intellectual culture. Despite this, some of the most famous British novelists wrote during this period, including Jane Austen and Mary Shelley. We shall see these writers later in the video. Representative writers of Romanticism. Jane Austen is a famous English writer. She wrote 6 novels. Her novels were set in the provincial world in which she lived, that of the comfortable rural middle class, and were often based on her observations of people she knew and her assessments of human nature. All her novels depict young women entering society, many of whom make mistakes or become confused but ultimately find their way to a happy marriage. Her best-known works are Sense and Sensibility, Pride and Prejudice, and Emma, all of which have been adapted into movies. Jane influenced many later writers including Charles Dickens, Thackeray and Anthony Trollope, George Eliot and Elizabeth Gaskell. William Blake is an English artist and a visionary poet. Largely unrecognized during his lifetime, Blake is now considered a seminal figure in the history of the poetry and visual arts of the Romantic Age. In 1803, Blake was accused of sedition, inciting resistance or insurrection against lawful authority. He was tried in 1804, but acquitted of the charge. Blake came to be known as a leading Romantic poet and philosopher, influencing other poets such as William Butler Yeats. Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Coleridge is an English poet, literary critic, philosopher and theologian who, with his friend William Wordsworth, was a founder of the Romantic movement in England and a member of the Lake Poets. In 1794, he published his first poetry in the Morning Chronicle. From 1797 to 1789, he completed some of his most known poems like The Ancient Mariner, a very beautiful poem that we shall see later in this video. John Keats is one of the major Romantic poets in England. His father's accidental death in 1804 and his mother's death in 1809 after a long bout with tuberculosis marked him with a sense of life precariousness, a theme that recurs in his poetry. He was apprenticed to a surgeon and in 1816 was licensed as an apothecary and surgeon. This training in science helped to ground his poetry in the sensory details of nature and everyday life. After his published poem O Solitude and the success it had, Keats was encouraged to quit his medical practice and devote his life to poetry. Keats viewed this as the noblest goal one could have and was filled with a deep sense of life. His first published collection was entitled Poems, 1817. His second work, Endymion, fell short of his own expectations, but his third collection, Lamia, Isabella, The Eve of St. Agnes, and Other Poems in 1820 contained some of the greatest poems in the English language, according to Jean-Claude Saillet in the Handbook of English Romanticism. He died at the age of 25. Lord Byron. The English poet and writer George Gordon Byron inherited his title of the 6th Lord Byron when he was 10 years old. From then he was called Lord Byron. His first publication were the first 2 cantos of Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, was based on a tour of Portugal, Spain, Greece and Turkey he took between 1809 and 1811. The work was immediately successful and he followed it with a series of tales featuring exotic Middle Eastern settings and hero villains. In 1816, he left England permanently, undertaking a series of trips which inspired Cantos 3 and 4 of Childe Harold between 1816 and 1818. Eventually he settled in Venice, Italy, where his immersion in the Italian language and culture had a profound influence on his work, particularly the satirical poem Don Juan. In his time, Byron's work was noted for its emphasis on freedom, its overtly sexual themes, its pessimism, and its use of tormented villainous heroes. Alexander Pushkin is Russia's most famous and beloved poet. His first poem was published when he was 15 years old. By the time he finished school, he was already a recognized literary figure. As a young man, he became involved in social reform and was chased into exile by the government for his political activities for nearly a decade. He was only 37 years old when he died. Pushkin challenged a man who insulted his wife. He was wounded and died soon thereafter. He became to be considered a romantic and the father of modern Russian literature, and his works have been adapted into operas by several Russian composers. Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley. Mary Shelley is an English writer. She is best known as the author of her horror novel Frankenstein or the modern Prometheus in 1818. She was married to the famous poet Percy Shelley. Made a widow at age 24, Shelley worked hard to support herself and her only son. She wrote several more novels, including Valperga and the science-fictional tale The Last Man in 1826. She also devoted herself to promoting her husband's poetry and preserving his place in literary history. Percy B. Shelley. Percy Shelley is a well-known English poet and the husband of Mary Shelley just previously mentioned. He and Mary Shelley wandered throughout Italy, and between 1818 and 1822, Shelley wrote some of his most important work, including Prometheus and Bound in 1820 and his Odes and Lyrics. His work is noted for its reflections on a great variety of fields, including science, history, philosophy, and for his attempt to synthesize seemingly conflicting theories in these fields. William Wordsworth, a famous English poet. Wordsworth began writing poetry as a young man, but his most notable works were composed after 1803, and many of them were collected in poems in 2 volumes in 1807. These volumes include the famous Ode Intimations of Immortality from Recollections of Early Childhood and Resolutions and Independence. His long poem, The Excursion, was published in 1814 and was widely read. In 1835, a major collection of his poems was published, and in 1843 he became Poet Laureate of England. Wordsworth's poetry is notable for his vision of the sublime or the divine in ordinary people and in places. He believed wholeheartedly in the redeeming power of nature and saw mystery and wonder in both people and natural things. Other major writers of the Romanticism movement in the USA are William Cullen Bryant, James Fenimore Cooper, Nathaniel Hawthorne, Washington Irving, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, James Russell Lowell, Herman Melville, Edgar Allan Poe, Walt Whitman, John Greenleaf Whittier. To make the video short, I did not deal with the works of these writers, but if you want me to, I'll do it. Selected works. If you are interested in reading some works that represent the literary movement Romanticism, I have selected a few ones for you. Childe Harold's Pilgrimage by Lord Byron, Eugene Onegin by Alexander Pushkin, The Tiger by William Blake, Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen, Prometheus and Bound by Percy Shelley, To Autumn by John Keats, Leaves of Grass by Walt Whitman, Moby Dick by Herman Melville, The Rime of the Ancient Mariner by Coleridge, The Scarlet Letter by Nathaniel Hawthorne, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow by Washington Irving, The Raven by Edgar Allan Poe, Daffodils by William Wordsworth, The Last of the Mohicans by James Fenimore Cooper, Snowbound by Joan Greenleaf Whittier, The Song of Hiawatha by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. Of course, this selection doesn't do justice to all the genius of those writers and their creativity, but I have selected some of their writings I personally believe they mostly represent Romanticism as a literary movement, and I wanted also to share them with you. Themes in Romanticism. Although we have already seen some of the characteristics of Romanticism, we also need to view some recurring themes in the literary production that has shaped the movement. Some of these themes are as follows. Dreams and visions. The idea that a person should compose poetry while asleep was commonplace among Romantics. One example of this can be found in Kubla Khan by Coleridge. Pantheism, which is the belief that there is no difference between the creator and creation, holds that God is not separate from the world but manifested in it. This idea was popular among Romantics. This sensation of a divine presence in all things marked a shift in public perceptions of nature. With the rise of the Industrial Revolution, cities became more crowded and dirty. The Romantics likewise viewed nature as a place of spiritual purity and peace, and where people could be redeemed by contact with the divine force immanent in the natural world. This can be found, for example, in Wordsworth's poem, Lines Composed a Few Miles Above Titon Abbey. The Self. During the Romantic period, for the first time in history, people became aware that there were parts of each individual's personality beyond the access of ordinary consciousness. The Romantics were fascinated with self-exploration and with the particulars of the individual's experience in the world. Previous writers had focused on politics, business, trade, and the lives of royalty or other famous people. The lives of ordinary people had been deemed unworthy of general interest. However, the Romantics were influenced by the events of the American and French revolutions and their underlying political theories. Unlike the revolutionaries, they believed the ordinary individual had the same rights and worth as any leader. This socio-political theory inspired writers to consider the worth of the individual in their work and to focus more on the experiences of ordinary people. Emotion and feeling. In keeping with an emphasis on the individual self, the Romantics valued emotion, intuition, and feeling over logic. They sought the sublime, a state of being in which a person was simultaneously awed, frightened, and filled with a sense of majesty and wonder. A poet's response to a wide, remote, and grandiose place in nature often invoked the sublime, as did the immense night sky, gigantic geological upheavals, and rivers. They appreciated the ruins of cathedrals and ancient religious sites. Style in Romanticism. The literary movement is mainly characterized by two aspects in style. Number one, the rejection of rigid poetic forms. In keeping with their glorification of the unlimited freedom and potential of the individual, the Romantics rejected old poetic conventions such as the heroic couplet used by Alexander Pope and asserted the value of the language spoken by ordinary people. They believed that the form of a verse should be shaped by the subject matter in contrast to the neoclassicists before them, who used rigid forms and shaped them material to fit them. Number two, an interesting aspect of the Romantic period was the emphasis on poetry. Most of the great Romantic writers were poets instead of novelists, as novels were widely regarded as inherently inferior to poetry. Critics have offered various reasons for this prejudice. Some suggest it arose from the fact that most novelists were female, and because women were devalued during the Romantic period, the work was discounted. Others note that many novels were of poor quality, giving the entire genre a bad reputation. In the Dictionary of Literary Biography, Mudge reports that the poets themselves, notably Wordsworth and Coleridge, campaigned against the spread of popular fiction, claiming it would lower the tastes of the reading public and leave them away from poetry. According to Mudge, Wordsworth wrote that newspapers, novels, plays, and even some poetry would encourage mental lethargy and reduce readers to a savage, uncivilized state. Example of Romanticism literature. For this video I have selected a very beautiful poem and one of my favorites. The Rime of the Ancient Mariner by Coleridge. The Rime of the Ancient Mariner was written in 1798 as part of Coleridge and Wordsworth's collection of poetry and lyrical ballads. This is Coleridge's longest major poem and began a great shift into modern romantic literature. There are many characters within this poem, but the main are that of the mariner and the wedding guest to whom he tells his story. We find the mariner out at sea with his crew of 200. The mariner decides to kill a bird, the albatross, and he has to face the consequences. After being approached by death and an angel of life who loved the creature, the mariner feels guilty and prays for his life. Since the poem is long, I've just picked up a few lines in which the bird, the albatross, helped the crew of the ship when they were facing snow, storm and death by guiding them in the sky towards the south and towards warmer regions and safer places. In the end, the mariner killed the albatross. Here are the lines. It is an ancient mariner. There was a ship, quoth he. The sun came up upon the left, out of the sea came he. And now there came both mist and snow, and it grew wondrous cold. The ice was here, the ice was there, the ice was all around. At length did cross an albatross. Thorough the fog it came. As if it had been a Christian soul, we hailed it in God's name. And a good south wind sprung up behind, the albatross did follow. Whiles all the night, through fog smoke white, glimmered the white moonshine. God save thee, ancient mariner, from the fiends that plague thee thus. I shot the albatross. Now we come to the end of this video. We have seen what is Romanticism, the period and context it flourished in. We've also went through some of the major characteristics, themes, style and major figures that represent this literary movement. I hope you have some idea about it now, and I hope this video will encourage you to read some of the mentioned literary works. Thank you for watching.